By the power vested in me, I hereby constitute this assembly as a legal congregation of the University of Pretoria. During this assembly, degrees and diplomas with all associated rights and privileges will be conferred and awarded on the candidates whose names appear in the program. Please take your seats. Ladies and gentlemen, we now request you to join us in silent prayer or meditation to give thanks for the achievements of our students. Thank you very much. Thank you. It is now my pleasure to welcome you all to this afternoon graduation of the Faculty of Theology and Religion and also the Faculty of Law. I wish in particular to welcome the recipient of the Honorary Doctorate degree, Professor J.S. Kloppenborg. We're very pleased to have him here this afternoon. The Registrar, Professor C. Nicholson, the Dean of the Faculty of Theology, Professor J. Pillay, the Dean of the Faculty of Law, Professor A. Borain, the Deputy Dean, Faculty of Theology, Professor D.J. Human, the Deputy Dean, Faculty of Law, Professor Koshke. I wish also to welcome the chairpersons of schools, heads of departments, directors, and honorary professors, lecturers and their spouses, supervisors, co-supervisors, honorary professors, and other lecturers, and the external examiners of the doctorate. The representative of the Student Representative Council, who will present the SRC academic honorary colors, all persons to whom degrees and diplomas will be conferred and awarded this afternoon, all spouses, parents, and other parties, as well as dignitaries we may not be aware of. You are all welcome, and it gives me pleasure again to congratulate the graduates and also to thank the faculty for the good work that has been done over the years and that has made it possible for this day to come. We congratulate all of you and wish you the very best in your careers. Now I request the Dean of Theology and Religion to introduce to me the candidate for the honorary doctorate.
Mr. Chancellor, I have the honor to introduce to you Professor John Sergeant Kloppenborg for the conferment of the degree Doctor of Divinity honoris causa. Professor Kloppenborg is one of the few New Testament scholars in the world who is considered by his peers as an expert in several fields and on several topics in the study of the New Testament and related literature. His work on the saying source, known as Q, has set the standard for the past 35 years. One of his most important publications on this topic is the critical edition of Q, a synopsis including the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, Mark, and Thomas, with English, German, and French translations of Q and Thomas. This publication has become the standard reference work for all scholars who engage with Q from a critical perspective. His work on the parables and available Roman Egypt papyri, as well as his work on James, are also well known. A commentary on James in the esteemed Armenia commentary series to be published later this year. He is currently also working on associations in antiquity and has recently co-authored the first of 5 volumes of associations in the Greco-Roman world, a source book. Finally, his valuable contribution to the study of the synoptic problem and Gospels has culminated in a publication titled Synoptic Problems, Collected Essays. Professor Kloppenborg is the associate editor of 11 theological journals in the world, has received the degree Doctor of Arts honoris causa from the University of Lethbridge in 2011, is an elected Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, and has recently been named as University Professor of the University of Toronto. Mr. Chancellor, I request you to confer the honorary doctorate on the candidate.
I hereby confer the degree Doctor of Divinity honoris causa with all the rights and privileges on Professor John Surgeon Kloppenborg. Congratulations. It is now a pleasure to call on Professor John Surgeon Kloppenborg to address the Assembly.
Mr. Chancellor, Madam Registrar, esteemed Deans of Theology and Law, Deputy Deans, colleagues, graduates, ladies and gentlemen. This is a singular honor for me to be standing on this stage, and something that was well beyond my expectations. I would not be here at all were it not for a chance visit to the University of Pretoria more than 10 years ago, where I met many brilliant colleagues and students in the Faculty of Theology and saw the many ways in which they had transformed the teaching of theology in a post-apartheid situation. And I would not be here were it not for a combination of love of the discipline, quite a bit of hard work, and what I want to talk about today, the sheer happenstance of encountering the right teachers at just the right time. It's sometimes said, and I think it's true, that most of us can look back and identify a teacher, whether in grade school or in high school or in university, who has shaped our lives in some way, someone who made us think differently about the world, someone who made us look differently at the world, someone who inculcated in us the love of learning. In the few minutes that I have, I would like to tell you two stories about teachers who made a difference. My oldest son, Stefan, when he was in grade 11, belonged to a robotics club. This was not an option when I went to high school, but it is, I expect, quite common nowadays. Stefan's teacher had arranged for 3 faculty members from the University of Toronto and a local IT company to come and visit the club and to assist the kids in their efforts to build a robot. There was an electrical engineer, a computer systems expert, and a mechanical engineer. All 3 visited the club. All 3 listened to the kids explain their challenges. All 3 gave the kids excellent advice. But it was the mechanical engineer who came back several more times, spent extra times with the students, helping them to imagine a variety of solutions to their problem. When my son was thinking about what program he would pursue at university, he was torn between mathematics, physics, and engineering. And in his final year of high school, he decided to apply for engineering, and it was mechanical engineering that he chose. Now, I would not, of course, reduce this decision to the contact that Stefan had with the University of Toronto mechanical engineer. He already had a pretty strong aptitude in that direction. But I also have no doubt that it was the generosity of this engineer that was instrumental in precipitating Stefan's decision. one good teacher made a difference, and he probably didn't know it. The second story is my own. I came to the University of Lethbridge, a small Canadian university, to pursue a degree in science, in biochemistry. I know why I had made that decision. It was because in high school I had decided that mathematics and the sciences presented more interesting and valuable intellectual challenges than humanities. I was wrong. And it was the pure happenstance of first taking an introductory course in philosophy, and then more philosophy courses, and then a course on Roman history by a distinguished Roman historian, and then more courses. These convinced me that humanities research indeed presented daunting intellectual challenges, and challenges that I wished to take on. Thinking about how we, as human beings, think and know things, or think we know things, thinking about the complex factors that make up human history, these issues turned out to be every bit as engaging and complex and challenging as chemistry. I recall sitting in a class in Greek history and realizing, with a combination of surprise and pleasure, that I really liked learning. In retrospect, I've also come to realize that the principal characteristic of the university and its great teachers is the relentless discontent for the current state of knowledge. It's this discontent, not being satisfied with what we think we know, how securely we know it, and what we make of those random bits of data that don't quite fit our theories. These discontents are what push us to explore further, to ask more questions, to look into new possibilities, and to advance human knowledge. The university is about unbounded curiosity. These recognitions were almost certainly due to the fact that the instructor was a great teacher himself and modeled in his own person what it was to be a scholar, that combination of endless curiosity, attention to fine detail and nuance, and the drive to understand things. This was the model that I needed to see. In subsequent history courses, this professor apparently recognized some spark of aptitude or intelligence in me and pushed me to develop competences in the basic tools of ancient Mediterranean history, offering several independent studies in Greek language and the interpretation of ancient texts. Then one September, when I came to his office to ask to do yet another course in Greek, he said no. It was time that I learned Coptic. I don't think I knew at the time that I'd never even heard of Coptic, and certainly didn't know it was. It's in fact the final incarnation of the ancient Egyptian language written in Greek characters. Certainly I had not imagined having had the opportunity to learn this language, but by the time I graduated, I had acquired many essential historical and linguistic skills, not so much by my own planning as by his direction and prodding, and I entered graduate school at the University of Toronto well equipped to pursue the study of religions in the ancient Mediterranean. I had even spent the last summer after my graduation over at Professor Müller's house every Monday evening, along with another friend who had learned Greek, reading Greco-Egyptian mummy labels. These are the ancient equivalent of a UPS shipping label, a wooden plaque tied around the neck of a mummy indicating who it was and which village in Egypt the mummy was to be transported to. This rather strange topic allowed me to learn paleography, that is, I call it the skill of reading ancient persons' poor penmanship, and to learn about burial practices and religion and a number of other things. My professor didn't have to do this. He didn't have to spend summer evenings with two undergraduates stumbling to read Greek letters scratched on wooden tablets in varying degrees of illegibility. But I doubt that I could have gained the kind of preparation for graduate school that I received from him. I doubt that I would be standing here, being honored by the University of Pretoria, without such mentoring, the model of scholarship, the prodding and encouragement that I received that summer. This teacher made a big difference, whether he knew it or not. Thus, in accepting this great honor that has been bestowed upon me by the University of Pretoria, I would like to acknowledge those teachers who, among the more mundane things that they all do, teaching, grading exams, sitting in endless committee meetings, make a difference in the lives of their students through acts of generosity, the extra effort that they take, or simply by modeling great teaching and great scholarship. Some make a difference by being tough and demanding, some by kindness, some by enthusiasm and the love of learning that they exemplify to their students. I pay tribute to all those teachers who make a difference, often without knowing it. I pay tribute to that University of Toronto engineer who affected the career course of my son, to the late Professor Dieter Müller, who profoundly affected my own education, and all those who, at the University of Pretoria, have touched the lives of students by being great teachers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Kloppenborg, for those words of wisdom, sharing your experiences. I'm sure we can all relate to that, the way that we are touched by others, the way that professors touch their students. And really, thank you very much. We look forward to a long association with this university, and that you will enrich us and be able to benefit from your wisdom and from your areas of specialization. Thank you very much, and everything of the best. May we give him a round of applause. Yeah, I'll now call on the Dean to introduce the candidates who are going to be receiving their degrees this afternoon.
Mr. Chancellor, the supervisors will now introduce the doctoral candidates.
Mr. Chancellor, I introduce to you Vincent Farirai Fenga, who has complied with the requirements for the degree Doctor of Philosophy, with a thesis titled Prophetic Preaching in New Pentecostal Christianity During the Socio-Economic and Socio-Political Crisis of Zimbabwe, 2000 to 2012, a practical theological exploration prepared under my supervision. In his thesis, the candidate analyzed prophetic preaching from the perspective of practical theology in general and homiletics in particular, an analysis of sermons and aphorisms used in New Pentecostal Christianity in Zimbabwe, and an in-depth comparison of Old Testament prophets and New Pentecostal prophets was done. The research illustrated that the preaching of the gospel of prosperity, accompanied by liturgical rituals of healing and deliverance, has been viewed as prophetic preaching in these churches. Through the 4 elements of preaching, a praxis theory was developed, focusing on the preacher, congregation, sermon, and Holy Spirit. The study revealed that prophetic preaching should address the social ills of the day rather than a gospel that points people to material gain, along with a dialogical approach to preaching in a context of poverty and oppression. Mr. Chancellor, I request you to confer the degree on the candidate.
Congratulations. I hereby confer the degree Doctor of Philosophy on Vincent Ferreira Fenga with all associated rights and privileges. Congratulations.
Mr. Chancellor, I introduce to you Anine Fisher, who has complied with the requirements for the degree Doctor of Philosophy, with a thesis titled An Inclusive Congregational Ministry Perspective on Youth and Children with a Disability in South Africa. In her thesis, the promovenda investigated the question whether congregational and youth ministry adequately reach, include, and serve children and youth with a disability and their families. Various types of disabilities and contexts in South Africa were investigated in order to better understand the limitations, needs, and challenges of this group. The influence of social constructs on their exclusion in South African cultures, society, and faith communities was explored. The study found that the inclusive congregational ministry model provides an avenue towards consciousness raising and the full integration of this group into South African faith communities. The study was concluded with the words, "It is not about putting up ramps, it is about breaking down walls." Mr. Chancellor, I request you to confer the degree on the candidate.
I hereby confer the degree Doctor of Philosophy on Anine Fisher with all associated rights and privileges.
Meneer die kanselier, ek stel Cornelius Murray aan u voor wat voldoende dan al die vereistes vir die graad PhD met 'n proefskrif getiteld Geïntegreerde bediening in die opbou van 'n identiteitsgedrewe missionale gemeente wat onder my promotorskap voorberei is. Die promovendus ondersoek die rol van die integrering en die koördinering van bedieninge in die identiteitsontwikkeling en identiteitsontdekking van 'n missionale gemeente. Identiteit word deur hom sowel eklesiologies as kontekstueel verstaan en al die bedieninge speel 'n rol in hierdie identiteitsontdekking en ontwikkeling. In die empiriese navorsing wat gedoen is onder meer as 96% van die predikante van die Hoëveld Synode van die Nederduits Gereformeerde Kerk, is gevind dat daar 'n gebrekkige besef by van die leraars bestaan dat identiteit 'n relasionele werklikheid is. Daarbenewens bestaan daar heel moontlike gebrekkige begrip dat 'n gemeente se bestaansdoel uit haar identiteit voortspruit. Die navorsing toon aan dat 'n beter verstaan van die rol wat integrering en koördinering van alle bedienings in identiteitsontwikkeling en identiteitsontdekking speel, dringend nodig is. Meneer die kanselier, ek versoek u om die graad aan die kandidaat toe te ken.
I hereby confer the degree Doctor of Philosophy on Cornelius Theodorus Murray with all associated rights and privileges.
Mr. Chancellor, I introduce to you Florence Matsveru, who has complied with the requirements for the degree Doctor of Philosophy with a thesis titled Well-Being and Work Performance of Christians in Managerial Positions, a Namibian Case Study, prepared under my supervision. In her doctoral thesis, the promovenda investigated the well-being and work performance needs of Christians in managerial positions and the role that family support can play in addressing those needs. Using a mixed methods approach based on Browning's revised correlational approach to practical theology, she concluded that Christian managers have both common and unique well-being needs which affect their work performance, and that family support plays a significant role in addressing those needs. Christian managers also have a part to play in gaining family support. The Church is well placed to intervene in enhancing family support for Christian managers. Biblical principles can be drawn from biblical examples and key scriptures in both Old and New Testament. Mr. Chancellor, I request that you confer the degree on the candidate.
I hereby confer the degree Doctor of Philosophy on Florence Matsevura with all associated rights and privileges.
Mr. Chancellor, I introduce to you Herbert Ndlovu, who has complied with the requirements for the degree Doctor of Philosophy with a thesis entitled African Customs and Values that can enhance Seventh-day Adventist missions to South Africans with a specific reference to the Zulu cultural heritage prepared under my supervision. In his doctoral thesis, De Profundis investigated how the Seventh-day Adventist Church, via a biblical and theological approach, can enhance the effectiveness of African customs and values in evangelizing indigenous South Africans. Combining qualitative and quantitative research and an extensive literature review, he concluded that the Seventh-day Adventist Church has to build a contextually relevant ministry based on African customs and values consistent with biblical principles in order to appeal to the indigenous South African population. The study also revealed that Africanness type of Christianity, evident in weddings, worship, meals, singing, dress code, dating, should be embraced by the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Mr. Chancellor, I request you to confer the degree on the candidate.
Philosophy on Herbert Ndlovu with all associated rights and privileges. Congratulations.
Mr. Chancellor, I introduce to you Victor Pillay, who has complied with the requirements for the degree Doctor of Philosophy, with a thesis titled Reconciliation, Reconstruction and Development as Paradigms for Missiology in South Africa, a reading of Professor David Bosch's Paradigms for Missiology, prepared under my supervision. In the doctoral thesis, the need for a reconciled people based on the premise of being in the process of reconstruction and development was explored as relevant missional paradigms for South Africa. The contextual challenges of the South African society were studied and analyzed to prepare for the intervention of the ecclesiastical and missional paradigm shift. An evaluation of the Christian and the Church was called for in order to establish where and what role they can play in the missional process. The conviction of an evangelical approach, which is guided by spiritual formation and empowerment, is to inform and impact this missional process in the context of church and praxis in South Africa. All of this culminates in the question of translatability, and the church in South Africa is espousing a faith-based reconciliation. Mr. Chancellor, I request you to confer the degree on the candidate.
I hereby confer the degree Doctor of Philosophy on Victor Pillay with all associated rights and privileges. Congratulations.
Mr. Chancellor, I introduce to you Abel Sitali, who has complied with the requirements for the degree Doctor of Philosophy with a thesis entitled Monotheism and Angelology in the Persian Period Yehud, prepared under my supervision and the co-supervision of Professor Sias Meyer. In his doctoral thesis, the Provendus investigated the nature of Israel's religion in the pre-exilic period in relation to that of her polytheistic neighbors. He showed that early Israelite religion was as syncretistic or polytheistic as that of her neighbors, and it was only after the exile that the monotheistic faith developed among the turning exiles in Yehud. In his analysis of the development of monotheism in post-exilic Yehud, he discussed the role of the doctrine of angelology. He argued that exclusive monotheism was achieved in part through the demotion of some of the old gods that were previously venerated in ancient Israel to the status of messengers, making them subordinate to Yahweh, the only legitimate God of Israel. Mr. Chancellor, I request you to confer the degree on the candidate.
I hereby confer the degree Doctor of Philosophy on Abel Sitali with all associated rights and privileges.
Mr. Chancellor, I introduce to you Smith Teti from Ghana, who has complied with the requirements for the degree Doctor of Philosophy with a thesis titled Spiritual Leadership Capital, a Theology of Poverty in Congregational Development, prepared under my supervision. In his doctoral thesis, the promovendus studied the missional theology of Ghanaian Pentecostals with reference to how their spirituality informs their leadership paradigms towards addressing poverty in their contexts. He advanced spiritual leadership capital theory. He argues that the inner virtues which spirituality affords people will and should create resilient leadership paradigms which contribute to social capital formation for the sustainable addressing of social problems such as poverty. Mr. Chancellor, I request you to confer the degree on the candidate.
I hereby confer the degree Doctor of Philosophy on Smith Francis Teddy with all associated rights and privileges. Congratulations.
Mr. Chancellor, the following candidates have complied with all the requirements for the degree Master of Theology. Specializing in dogmatics and Christian ethics, Monetti Moshe Dibach. Specializing again in dogmatics and Christian ethics, Ronald Nelueni. Specialization in practical theology, Anandi Krailan. Mr. Chancellor, the following candidate has complied with all the requirements for the degree Master of Arts in Theology, specialization in New Testament Studies, Kenosi Motuku, with distinction. Specialization in Practical Theology, Zimila Fuku. Armstrong Kwakwari. John Leakey, Practical Theology. Okay. Mr. Chancellor, the following candidates have complied with all the requirements for the postgraduate diploma in theology. Folake Aluko. Mr. Chancellor, the following candidates have complied with all the requirements for the degree Bachelor of Arts in Theology. Patience Insele. I think that's it. Thank you.
I now call on the Dean of the Faculty of Law to present the candidates who are receiving the degrees this afternoon.
Mr. Chancellor, the supervisors will now introduce the doctoral candidates.
Mr. Chancellor, I introduce to you Ogene Riobaru Esther Eberechi, who has complied with the requirements for the degree Doctor of Laws, with a thesis titled Access to Justice for Victims of Sexual Violence in Refugee Camps, prepared under my supervision. In her thesis, Access to Justice for Victims of Sexual Violence in Refugee Camps, the prima venda argued in support of access to justice for the victims of sexual violence in refugee camps. The study contributes to the criminal justice system, and more specifically to refugee law, by answering the question, how can victims of sexual violence in refugee camps have access to justice? The prima venda proposes a protocol additional to the Convention relating to the status of refugees of 28 July of 1951 on protection of refugees against sexual violations and access to justice. The candidate also argues in favour of a one-stop facility for addressing sexual violence. Mr. Chancellor, I request you to confer the degree on the candidate.
I hereby confer the degree Doctor of Laws on Ogene Riobaru Eberechi with all associated rights and privileges. Congratulations.
Mr. Chancellor, I introduce to you Jeffrey S. Sitang, who has complied with the requirements for the degree Doctor of Laws, with a thesis titled The Impact of Threshold Agreements on the Organizational Rights of Minority Trade Unions, prepared under the supervision of Professor Stefan van Eck. In his thesis, the promovendus assessed the impact of thresholds of representativity on the acquisition of organizational rights through the lens of constitutional democracy. The study makes a substantial contribution towards the existing knowledge in the field of labor law and the rights of trade unions in particular. The thesis favored pluralism rather than majoritarianism, and it makes valuable recommendations about the collective bargaining model for South Africa, which protects the rights to freedom of association. Mr. Chancellor, I request you to confer the degree on the candidate.
I hereby confer the degree Doctor of Laws on Jeffrey Esitang with all associated rights and privileges.
Mr. Chancellor, I introduce you to Kapwadi Lukanda, who has complied with the requirements for the degree Doctor of Laws with a thesis titled Legal Accountability of International Financial Institutions in Financing Development, prepared under my supervision. In his thesis, the promovendus investigated the laws that apply to international financial institutions to determine the extent to which underlying accountability mechanisms have achieved or failed to achieve the level of accountability and justice expected by affected private third parties. The study showed a disparity in the standard of protection enjoyed by different categories of stakeholders. The weakness of the standards that apply to affected private third parties is an impediment to advancing their interests through an accountability process. The study recommends shifting the focus of existing laws and policies towards greater protection of the interests of affected private third parties. It also advocates the incorporation of community development agreements in the overall structure of an IFI-funded project. The study makes a substantive contribution to scholarship through its analysis of legal accountability and the combination of different disciplines of public international law. Mr. Chancellor, I request you to confer the degree on the candidate.
I hereby confer the degree Doctor of Laws on Kapwadi Lukanda with all associated rights and privileges.
Mr. Chancellor, I introduce to you Mr. Milton Overwar, who has complied with the requirements for the degree Doctor of Laws with a thesis titled The International Criminal Court and Positive Complementarity, Legal and Institutional Framework, prepared under the supervision of Professor D. Recladi. In his thesis, The International Criminal Court and Positive Complementarity, Legal and Institutional Framework, the promovendus examined the content of positive complementarity as distinct from complementarity as an admissibility concept. The study considered that complementarity as an admissibility concept in the Rome Statute was a tool for the distribution of jurisdictional competence between domestic and international tribunals. It prioritizes and thus encourages domestic exercise of jurisdiction. Positive complementarity should thus be understood as policies, tools, actions to enable states to exercise jurisdiction over atrocity crimes. The study proposed a restructuring of the Assembly of States Parties to the Rome Statute, including the establishment of an independent office at the Secretariat to address positive complementarity to promote capacity for domestic exercise of jurisdiction. The proposed institutional framework would support the ICC and the national jurisdictions in promoting the exercise of national-level jurisdiction and thus effectively combat impunity. Mr. Chancellor, I request you to confer the degree on the candidate.
I hereby confer the degree Doctor of Laws on Melton Owa with all associated rights and privileges. Congratulations.
Mr. Chancellor, I introduce to you Ditaba Petrus Rantsane, who has complied with the requirements for the degree of Doctor of Laws with a thesis titled Consumer Arbitration in South Africa and its Effect on the Consumer's Right to Redress and Enforcement, prepared under my supervision and Professor Botha as co-supervisor. The thesis notes with concern the outdated nature of private arbitration law applied in South Africa. Arbitration legislation thus needs to align with the needs of the business world. The primary research aims are to determine whether private arbitration, if properly conducted, provides the parties with the envisaged benefits and whether private arbitration and private arbitration process are constitutional. International arbitration law as well as selected comparative jurisdictions are also analysed. The thesis establishes that the current legal framework does not give adequate protection to the rights of consumers whose constitutional rights are potentially contravened by unfair arbitration clauses. The thesis offers recommendations for reform of South African arbitration law, which include draft clauses designed to offer the necessary protection to consumers and preserve the initial benefits of arbitration. Mr. Chancellor, I request you to confirm the degree on the candidate.
I hereby confer the degree Doctor of Laws on Ditaba Petrus Rantsane with all associated rights and privileges. Congratulations.
Mr. Chancellor, I introduce to you Martha Gertruida van Niekerk, who has complied with the requirements for the degree Doctor of Laws with a thesis titled A Comparative Analysis of the Role of the Central Bank in Promoting and Maintaining Financial Stability in South Africa, prepared under my supervision. In her thesis, the promovenda analysed the introduction of the Twin Peaks model of financial regulation in South Africa and how it impacted on and expanded the financial stability mandate of the South African Reserve Bank. Based on comparative analysis of the Twin Peaks models in Australia and the Netherlands, important findings were made regarding the expanded financial stability role of central banks post-GFC. The study makes a substantial contribution to the existing body of knowledge through its analysis of the Financial Sector Regulation Act and the institutional and legislative framework it has created for effective implementation of the SARB's financial stability mandate, and also for the broader operation of the Twin Peaks model. Mr. Chancellor, I request you to confer the degree on the candidate.
I hereby confer the degree Doctor of Laws on Martha Gertruida van Niekerk with all associated rights and privileges. Congratulations.
Mr. Chancellor, the following candidates have complied with all the requirements for the degree Master of Laws by coursework, specializing in banking law. Chepo Fare. Kirsten Hunt. In tax law, Keen Brentley. Peter Kiljan. In mercantile law, Sophia Clark. Gomotso Gongwane. Kristen Lewis with distinction. Alfred Nslongo. In intellectual property law, Daniel Badenhorst. Gabriela Esmeraldo. In child law, Vuyokasi Ketelo. In law of contract, Roxanne Gilbert with distinction. In corporate law, Nkululeko Masondo. LZ Willefeer. In multidisciplinary human rights, Olivia Kopp. In constitutional and administrative law, Ntola Nolutando. In consumer protection law, Lulama Potwana. Mr. Chancellor, the following candidates have complied with all the requirements for the degree Master of Philosophy. Petronella Brits. Muyamba Mangu. Mr. Chancellor, the following candidates have all complied with all the requirements for the degree Bachelor of Laws. Jan Ackerman. Emma Alima Habadi with distinction. Robin Bester. Christian Bisrat Yibas. Aiden Kadase. Roxanne Chabon with distinction. Maxine Clement. Riani Deacon. Alexander Moore Ferguson. Deborah Huabene. Cliff Latswayo. Annene Houg. Monique Jacobs. Karen Jansen van Vuren. Casper Joubert. Jacqueline Kanyange. Melissa Kemp. Kalalelo Komane. Chiamu Kanope. Mampokeng Kutumela. Lerato Mafuya Titilola. Mikael Maharaj. Raisibe Mapeto. Dadford Matkalboso. Lizzie Masangu. Ntokoto Matebula. Sipokazi Mato. Sibale Mslongo. New Motloewa. Rondile Mtsetwa. Larissa Munro. Lerato Nwampe. Masvita Nabereka. Nicole Rens. Pauli Roos. Sipesisle Shongwe. Oriana Toa. Mamusadi Tamaha. Dimpo Thema. Dimitri Tesone. Louis Dawson. Peter van Duin. Kayla van Wyk.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end. I think we had a very successful afternoon session, and we should congratulate ourselves. Let's have another round of applause for the graduates. We have now come to the end of the proceedings. Before we close, I wish to invite all present for refreshments afterwards in front in the marquees. You are now requested to stand for the singing of the national anthem and to remain standing until the assembly has been dissolved and the academic procession has left the auditorium. By the power vested in me, I hereby dissolve this assembly of the University of Pretoria. Thank you.